So back in our index.js, earlier you saw how we could rewrite this asynchronous code that used the callback-based approach. We rewrote this using promises. And there I told you that we can make this code even simpler. So now in JavaScript, we have a new feature called Async and Await. If you're familiar with C#, there we also have the same feature, Async and Await. It's exactly the same thing. So Async and Await helps you write asynchronous code like synchronous code. Let me show you what I mean by that. So Async and Await approach. I'm going to rewrite these few lines where we are using a promise. I'm going to rewrite these using Async and Await. So we call getUser with 1. Now this getUser function returns a promise. Now, anytime you're calling a function that returns a promise, you can await the result of that function and then get the actual result, just like calling a synchronous function. So here we can get the result and store it in a user object. Similarly, now that we have a user object, we can call getRepositories to get the repositories for this user. So we pass user.github username. Now again, this function returns a promise. So we can await the result and then get the repositories and store them here. And finally, now that we have the repositories, we can call getCommits, pass the first repository. And again, because this function returns a promise, we can await it and get the commits and store them here in this constant. Finally, we can do a console.log of commits. So we can see with this await operator, we can write asynchronous code that looks like synchronous code. This is much easier to read and understand than callbacks or even promises. We don't have to go through a chain of calls to the then method. So this is await. But where is async? Well, whenever you use the await operator in a function, you need to decorate that function with the async modifier. In this particular example, we have written this line in index.js outside of a function. Now, this is a requirement by JavaScript engines that whenever you use await, you should have a function that is decorated with async. And you will find out why in a second. So I'm going to define a function here. Let's call this display commits, because eventually, after all these asynchronous operations, we're displaying the commits for this user. So display commits, and I'm going to move all these lines inside of this function. Now we're using await inside of a function, so we should decorate that function with async. And finally, we call this function here. Now look at the return type of this function. It's returning a promise of void. That means a promise that once fulfilled doesn't result in a value. It's void. So basically, this is telling us that async and await are built on top of promises. There are syntactical sugars in the language that allow us to write asynchronous code that looks synchronous. Internally, when the JavaScript engine executes this code, it's going to convert this code into something like this. So even though our code looks synchronous, it doesn't execute synchronously. In other words, when we are awaiting the result of this function, we are not really waiting or blocking in a synchronous fashion. So in terms of the code execution, when a JavaScript engine executes this line, at this point, it's going to release our thread and make it available to do other work. When the result of the getUser function is available, then we come back here, store the result in the user constant, and call this second line. Again, we have await, so the thread is released to do other work. So one more time, async and await is just syntactical sugar. Internally, we use promises. Our code still runs asynchronously, but it looks and reads synchronously. So to verify this, let's go back in terminal and run this program. But before we go there, let's just comment out the first implementation, which is promise-based. Now back in the terminal, let's run node index.js. So we have before and after, 2 seconds later, we read something from a database, then we call GitHub, and again, and finally we have the commit, okay? Now one last thing before we finish this lecture. In our promise-based approach, we use this catch method to get any errors. When using async and await, we don't have this catch method. The way we get the errors is using a try catch block. So in this function, we wrap our asynchronous code inside of a try block. So we put try here, put all this code inside this block, and then we have a catch block that gets an error object. So we try to execute these lines, and if anything goes wrong, then the catch block is executed. So here we get an error object, and we can display the error on the console. So now let's simulate an error. So back to our get repositories function. Here I'm going to reject this promise. So instead of resolving it, I'm going to reject with an error saying could not get the repos. Okay, now back in the terminal, let's run this one more time. So before and after, 2 seconds later, we read a user from database. We called GitHub API, but something failed. So we got this error, could not get the repos. So when using async and await, you need to wrap your code inside of a try catch block.